Well, we'll start the history of 120 odd years of the Methodist Church in Bonner Springs. We started the Union Sunday School, had off and on meetings from 1887-88, but in 1891 it's sort of like a biblical start. 2 women at a well. And I want to read what the Reverend Hamilton wrote. In March of '91, I was appointed to the Glenwood charge, which was composed of 3 points: Glenwood, where I preached every Sunday morning, White Church, and Edwardsville, each of which had a night service every 2 weeks. I generally went from Glenwood to Edwardsville the afternoon of a Sunday night at that place. When the days grew hot in the summer, I used to stop to get a drink of water at a well in Bonner Springs. One very warm afternoon in August, I stopped for a drink and rested my horse under a large tree where 2 ladies came to me and said they had learned I was a Methodist preacher, wanted to know if I would preach in Bonner 2 weeks from that afternoon, which I promised I would. The 2 ladies were Sister F.M. Downs and Sister C.S. Everett. At the first service, only 3 were present: Sisters Downs, Everett, and Drone. The service was held in a small brick schoolhouse in front of the east, which is where our city hall is now. I suppose my sermon must have seemed like a personal message to those 3 faithful sisters, and they tried to encourage me. I left an appointment for 2 weeks, and the audience nearly filled the room. I conducted a revival meeting in the fall of '91, and at the close of that meeting, 41 of the converts joined our church, and the class was permanently organized. At the conference in '92, I advised the dropping of White Church, taking Bonner as part of the Glenwood charge, and that happened. So that's how it started. Two women at a well. And of course the women have been a driving force, I would say, in this church and most Methodist churches over the years. I know when we had a visiting pastor back when who looked out at our congregation and congratulated us with the number of men in the congregation, that a lot of them were, where he went, were mostly women. Well, from '94 to 1900, the Epworth League would have camp meetings here in Bonner Springs in what it said was the grove of trees. They'd have several hundred young people come here for a week of camping. And the one in 1900 had over 750, had 150 tents. Well, and so that got the Methodist here going. Well, in '99, they thought by then they needed a permanent building rather than the schoolhouse. So Sylvester McDaniel, who was the son of John McDaniel, who bought the land from Tiblo and laid out Tiblo to start with and all, he donated the land, which was there at Cedar and 2nd, where the old church was, and gave $600 toward the start of the church. Well, by that fall, they had the floor and the roof and the walls up, and no furniture, nothing else in it. And so they met there through the winter and all, and then the next year they finished it. So in 1907, they needed a parsonage, and so they built one at 140 South Nettleton. It's gone. $2,500. Well, also in 1907, the church has been up 7 years, they decided they needed a basement. So they hand evacuated the basement underneath that church. That's what I'm thinking. Wow. But when we attended came in '64, that base was big enough. We had church dinners, we had, they had a kitchen, we had everything, Sunday school classes and all, but they hand dug it out. Then, in 1910, they held the first, you might say, Methodist Youth Institute out at Lake of the Woods, Lakewood Park. And that kicked off. They had 300 there, but it rained most of the day. But that was the Epworth League that they called it at that time. And when I was in youth group in Wathena, it was the Epworth League. But after that 1910, they moved it to Baldwin, to Baker University, where the Institute is still held to that day. In 1951, when I was president of the Kansas City District, the Kansas City District used to be Wyandotte, Leavenworth, Atchison, and Doniphan counties, all up along. And so Doniphan, where we grew up in Wathena, was there. Very active with our church youth. And I have the list of all the members from all the districts, from all the churches there at 51. And from Bonner Springs, there was a lady that looked like, I thought might recognize that name, Dorothy Bushnell was her name. And so we were there at the same time. It's interesting. Well, in 1914, they remodeled. 14 years, they thought they better add on. They put in a balcony and a kitchen and a choir loft and stained glass windows. And right outside the door here is stained glass Methodist Church, 1914. And when we moved, we brought that. And then Gene Moeller, I think, paid to have the Christ knocking at the door, stained glass, enclosed and over there on the left. Well, 23, we built another parsonage. This time on 122 Alcott for $10,000. And Herman Teaton gave the land. Well, that parsonage went away when we had urban renewal in the 70s, and we didn't own it then, somebody else did, and that's where they built the high-rise Nettleton Manor right there across the road. Well, in 1939, there was another renovation, and I mentioned the ladies of the church. Well, there was an organization we had here called King's Daughters, and I should back up a little bit. I hope Tim and I would be here, because several months ago he said, we ought to update our history, because it hadn't been done. He had been to a DeSoto service where they celebrated 150 years, and they had the list of all the pastors and some history. So I called him when I said I'd do this, and we met Monday and went into the church closet, and there's 5 big history. So we took these banker boxes out and dug through it, and actually found enough information along with some internet search and some emails to former pastors to find out exactly when those pastors were here. And we had it up until 1990 when Earl Perry was here. Somebody had made that, gave us that list. And so we now know that we had Earl here, and Earl was here for 4 years or 5 years, and then he went down to Mexico City and taught in the seminary there, and then came back, and he was here 10 years. He was been our longest pastor, and during his pastorate we built this, didn't we? So, But anyway, in 1994, we had David Watson came here with his 2 kids. He's still around. 94 to 97, Jan Rind. And it's interesting, they had a conference office, had her serving later. And when I contacted her, she said, no, I was retired then. I was here when you had to be, 94, 97. Then for 7 years, we had Doug Brown, who was quite musical. I remember we heard he played the organ at Institute when we'd go down there. He was at Baker. Then we had Reverend Dennis Ackerman, 5 to 9. And the blank I couldn't get filled in was 9 to 11. And we remember Dan Waters, who had to drive over from Lawrence or something. Yeah, anyway. Went to the internet, put in Reverend Dan Waters, up it came, we had a list, and he was here 94, 97, along with, 9 to 11. And we also had an associate, Ken Mestemacher. Remember Ken? Yeah. Well, I remember Ken because on Christmas Eve, he preached a sermon that went on and on and on. And Gene Knight told me, he said, I thought I was going to hit the organ and end it right then, because Christmas Eve, when you've got, people, you don't want to go on and on. But anyway. And then we had Reverend Jan Todd, and Jan brought us into the electronic age, I think. Now we've got the nice screen and all that kind of thing. And then she was followed by Larry Keller, who only served 4 weeks because he died of a heart attack while here from July 1st to July 28th. And then he was followed by Cynthia Meyer, who was here to 14 and 15, and then Andy came in 15. So he served 8 years. He served quite a few. And of course now we have Reverend Garrett Ray that's coming. Well, as I mentioned, the women of the church, the King's Daughters, were founded in 1986 in New York City. And by 1936 had 70,000 women and $2 million administered yearly. And in 1919, the Bonner Springs chapter was started. So the minutes for the 37 and 38 were in the archives. And I'll quote from March of 37. From old business came a motion of repairs of the church. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Ewing were appointed as a committee to keep the men hustling that these repairs might be made soon. They paid for the telephone at the church. March 25th was set for a day to clean the church. Mrs. Baker made the motion to get a man to do the work under the supervision of the women, who each paid 25 cents toward his salary. And a list of all the members that gave 25 cents. Then the April minutes. The friendliness of the church was brought to light and quite a discussion followed it. Sound familiar? It was decided there should be a committee at the church door each Sunday to welcome new folks, non-regular attendance, and help promote a closer feeling of friendliness among the people. Then in 1940, the organization joined with other Methodist churches. They consolidated the women's groups, the Ladies' Aid, the Altar Society, the King's Daughters, and formed the Women's Society of Christian Service, which is what I grew up with. So when they rededicated in 39, after they paid for those updates, this is the program that the King's Daughters had, and also had a brief history of the church there. Well, in 54, we had over 300 and some in Sunday school. It's interesting how we grew too. And for instance, we started out like in 1903, we had 208 members and 170 in Sunday school. Average attendance, 132. But it kept growing and growing and growing, and in 63 to 66, when Scheuerman was here, when we first came, we had a membership of 820. With average with Sunday school enrollment of 418. And they were having average attendance of 300. And they said, you know, we need to build an educational building. And so they did, and it's still there. When we moved here in 60, I'm sorry, okay, let me move on. Okay, okay. Oh, I'm a little ahead of myself. In 69, remember the Christian church had a fire, and we let them have their services here. While we had Sunday school, they had church. When we had church, they had Sunday school. And so they let us do that for a while. Well, in okay, so what we did when we built the church and moved over here, there was quite a stirring. Here we were, and this was before we came, downtown church, and we were growing, and what to do. There's no parking and such as that. So they bought this land for $19,000, and I remember people, oh, will people come? Well, we needed parking, we've got that. And the morning that we dedicated that, why, we had a closing of the church service there on Alcott. And we carried a torch from there to here. And it said that the youth Sunday school class, headed by Roger Miller, was organizing it. I had the Sunday school class when we first came here, the high school class, because I was 32 and, you know, I guess young enough to handle them. Well, that Sunday school class, pretty good class. Had Bruce Coleman, Del Coleman, Linda Coleman, Dan Grinstead, the other Grinstead, Homer Meese's son, anyway, a pretty good class we did. And so we brought the torch over here, and we had a nice dedication, and some of the programs are still over there. Well, in '83, the organ that we have now was not as big as it was, and so we upgraded the organ for $22,000. So in '88 and '89, we decided we needed to build a fellowship hall. I mean, if we had a church dinner, we did it in the hallway over there, or outside. You know, we had our barbecue, we had it outside, this and that. And so we hired a money-raising fella, came up from Wichita. And of course he told us that we built this church backwards. That most churches build a fellowship hall, you know, somewhere they can meet, and then when they got going big enough, then they built, because it was easier to raise money for a worship center than a fellowship hall, and we found that to be true. The first, when we built the church, we sold bonds, $100 bonds that you could buy at 6%. And so most of the church actually bought them and helped build it. A lot of them then just gave the bonds back, and so we were able to be pretty much debt-free when we started. Well, we had also just built a parsonage next door, and Dan, not Dan, who, Dal Grinstead was in charge of kind of helping do that. And they put me in charge of the fundraising. And so I asked Dale if he would be interested in helping, you know, manage with the builders this. And he said no. He was retiring too, I think. He didn't want any more to do whatever. And as we were leaving the meeting, Merle Snack said, you know, if you'll give me help, I'll do it. Well, he was interested in a place for the Scouts too, because the Scouts are growing and growing and growing. So if you look at these walls, all put up with volunteers, he would call and say, all right, we're going to do this and I'll need that. And we'd call people that were on the list, Larry Sheaf or whatever, those people, and got the walls in. Cliff Gallagher strung all the electrical. We didn't put in the ceiling or the tough stuff, but we did the rest. The basement, we did what we did there, painted and got her done. Well, during that year, 89, we had an exchange too. Doug Brown went over to England, and we had an English pastor, Reverend Hammond, that came over here for a few months. Well, in 91, we had our 100th birthday, and there's a dedication program and a little history of it. The chieftain used to cover that. Nobody covers now, but then it was another big deal. We had a nice dedication. And in 1997, we decided the old church, which at that time was bought by the Assembly of God. That was interesting. After we left the church, it was vacant for a while, and then the city rented it to put in the Opportunity group that was a precursor to Von Trent. They had their office there for a while. And I won't take all the credit, but one night I was at the pharmacy and a young couple came in. And he was a minister, and their church had just been condemned down between here and Kansas City, Kansas, because they were widening the highway. And I said, so you're looking for a church building? He said, well, ours for sale. It was Norman Brooks, who pastored the Assembly of God there for a long time. And of course, it burned, they rebuilt, and now they're across the river, and Proclaim Church is there, but still being used. Well, I want to read about the Bell Memorial because the first person was Theo Stoneking, who remembers the moving of the bell from the old church to the new church as a human labor. A flatbed truck, which had a winch, was borrowed to use for transportation. Several other men from the church worked with Theo in the lowering of the bell from the old belfry. This was accomplished with ropes. The bell was lowered and placed upon the wooden planks with rollers underneath. Then the bell was gently glided through the use of ropes secured to the frame which held the bell, which was backed up to the steps. After the truck carried the bell to its new destination, the same method was employed to move the bell up the walk and into the courtyard. There the bell was placed on top of a railroad tie platform. This was the home of the bell for many years. Well, you know where it is now. It's right out there where everybody can see it. Well, Bud Shermer wrote this about a remembrance. My fondest remembrance of the bell and belfry tower in our former church are those that would normally excite any small boy. The belfry tower was, for several years, our regular Sunday school classroom. It was the highest area in the church. We probably reasoned that we might get a few brownie points from God being a little closer to Him. and did enjoy the beautiful stained glass windows, and it was a very own private classroom. And we had access to that long rope, the bell rope, which we knew if pulled would wake the town. Mr. Lewis Whitrock, the local male terrier, was our teacher. His voice was low and soothing. He commanded respect, and he had a great chuckle. Paul remembers a room about 10 feet square with chairs lining the perimeter. He remembers the rope coming through the hole in the ceiling, probably sisal or manila, dark in color. We both remember jealously expressed by younger members and by the girls whose classrooms were not quite as private and secluded as ours in the Belfry Tower. So, anyway, where to be? Well, in '99, I think probably a lot of you remember our leaky roof. We had trouble with water coming down all the time. Whoever this architect was that designed a flat roof should have known better. But so we raised money and we elevated the roof so it water wouldn't stand. And so the last big thing that I guess you could say that we had done was that. So over this umpteen hundred years, this church has grown and grown. What we haven't grown is membership. And actually, the membership that they used to have listed was just about anybody that showed up, I think. 500, 600 and all that. Well, we have a church apportionments for the organization that each church is apportioned some, and it used to be based on your membership and other things. Well, they decided, and I remember when Bill Stevens came, we cut about 100 and some members off. I was on the committee, and we went through the list, and we contacted them, and we wrote. In fact, I remember the letter said, our apportionments are, and every member, which you remember anyway, ends up $52.umpteen. One member actually sent a check back for $52.umpteen. But anyway, when they changed that to based on our budget, I think it is now, yes. And membership doesn't count. We haven't paid much attention to membership for a while. So Sheila and Marcia Harrington spent a lot of time here in the last year contacting members on the list, finding out where they were, talking to them. Do you want to stay? Do you want to? Some have already transferred somewhere else. Some say no. Some, came through Sunday school and then got the confirmation class and then went off and whatever. So don't have a exact number now, but I think it's around 220 something and all that. So here we are. So where are we going? Well, it'll be interesting to see what our new pastor has. We've had 45 pastors since we were started. 44 really, because Earl Perry served twice. So Garrett comes in as our 45th, and we'll see what he has. You've seen his letter. He seems like ideal. Charles, you've met with him? No? Okay. Anybody here on that committee that met with him? I think Norma Curtis was telling us, so anyway. But he looks like the future's ahead of us. Now, I gave the women a lot of credit, but I ought to give the Methodist men some credit too, because we've done a lot over the years to keep things going. And I think it's small groups that get things done. So hopefully we've got our youth program going, we've got things going, so let's look for another 100 and some years. Thank you.